can see that we still have people joining the webinar as I speak, but given it is now 1 minute past the hour, let's make a start. So again, welcome to everyone who's joined what is the last Insignia webinar of 2020. It's a record year in terms of webinars. We usually run a webinar at most every month, usually every other month. We've actually run, this is the 23rd webinar we will have run in 2020, and the reason is the topic of the year. The reason is COVID. In the middle part of the year and indeed in the spring, we were running very, very regular webinars to share advice and provide whatever help we could for organisations that were facing that challenge, particularly in the early months when it very much was crisis management mode. So thanks to everyone who's been on earlier webinars. Traditionally, you will know that in these sessions, we talk about organisational resilience and we share our experience, our tips, our best practice on how organisations should prepare for and handle challenging situations. And sometimes we have guest speakers sharing their experience on managing crises within organisations. But today, I thought, given the challenges that we've all been through, and particularly those of you that work in the front line of crisis management, whether that's as a risk professional, a communication professional, or a business continuity professional, for the first time, I wanted, rather than to focus on the organisation, to instead focus on the individual, because I know everybody on this call will have been working flat out throughout 2020. And whilst we're looking after our organisation and our colleagues, sometimes maybe we're not doing quite as much as we should do to look after ourselves. And that really was the thinking behind this final webinar of the year, focusing on you rather than the organisation. So first of all, some introductions. I think most of you know me, but I know some of you don't. So my name is Jonathan Hemus. I'm the Managing Director of Insignia. We're a specialist crisis management consultancy that works with organisations to help their leaders do and say the right things on the worst days of their business lives. And it's safe to say that this year has presented challenging days for all of us, and we've been working hard to support, advise, and give whatever counsel we can to our clients to help get them through that. And today, I'm really delighted to be joined by Simon Shepard. Simon is someone I met a couple of years ago and has a very interesting background and a very interesting perspective on personal resilience and how that affects businesses and individuals and the ripple effects of that. So without further ado, I'm going to leave Simon to give you a more detailed introduction to himself. Simon's then going to spend about 40 minutes talking with you about personal resilience. We'll have time for 5 or 10 minutes of questions at the end. As ever, please post those via the question pane or chat pane within your control panel. And then I'll come back at the end with some thoughts about some upcoming things coming for 2021. But Simon, I'm now going to endeavour to give control to you so that you can take over the presentation, and look forward to hearing your presentation. I believe it is now with you, Simon.
Hopefully we're there. Is that work, Jonathan?
It looks good to me. I'm sure the audience
Excellent.
will shout if it's not, but I can certainly see it perfectly.
Good, the most stressful part of the day sorted, done and dusted. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much, Jonathan, for asking me to talk this afternoon. The title of the session is The Data of Fluffy Stuff and the Battle for Resilience. I hope this is going to be a session that pretty much does what it says on the tin. So fluffy stuff, yeah, we'll be talking about stress and sleep and maybe energy and exercise. We might even get on to relationships and values. And as for data, well, I'm going to be reflecting on some of the physiological data that I've collected over the last decade from UK PLC as they get on with their day-to-day lives, and tell you some stories. Tell you some stories about resilience and how people sometimes get it right, but often get it wrong. This is not going to be a session where I give you a magic bullet. I give you those marginal gains. I'm have no right to tell you how to lead your life or tell you what to do, so there's going to be none of that either. But I hope it's a session that gives you 30 minutes, 40 minutes, 50 minutes, whatever it is, to stop and think about something very important, and that thing is you. I suspect the majority of you have been doing a heck of a lot of thinking about a whole host of other things this year, and what often happens, we often put ourselves to the bottom of the list. So that would be the one goal I have, to give you some time for you. I always like to start these sessions by asking a couple of questions. In fact, I often ask way more than that, but just a couple of questions to get you started. And if you've got a pen and paper, I'd actually like you to write down an answer to both these questions. So the first question is, what level of expectation do you place upon yourself? 0 is none, and 10 is incredibly high. So what level of expectation do you place on yourself? Just give yourself a score out of 10. And the second question I would like to ask is, how would you rate the fatigue across your organization currently? 10 would be very high, 0 would be we're fresh as daisies. So just hopefully you've now got a couple of numbers in front of you. I know some of you, in the areas of risk, you'll want to create pivot tables and all sorts of other things. Just go from the gut on this one. It's a simple question, simple answer, somewhere between 0 and 10, no decimal points required. So that started to get you to have a little think about you and your organization. Just a little bit more about me. I'm a physiotherapist by background. That's been my office for the last 3 decades. It's a rather unusual picture of Lord's cricket ground. There's some blue sky. There's some people inside it. We haven't really seen that this year. A few of the members look as if they're awake, so they were probably photoshopped in, if I'm honest. And this is the sort of site that greeted me when I started back in 1991. That's a chap called David Boone, world-class international player, batting number 3 for Australia. There he is, fag in hand, beer in the other hand. I think he still holds the record for the most amount of beer drunk on a flight between Sydney and London at 52 cans. And people often say, well, is that the Australians celebrating another victory? Maybe, but it could equally have been them sort of warming up before the start of play, because that is what it was like back in the day. And the reason I show those 2 pictures is, if I look at the one on the left, do you know what? Not a lot has changed in that world in the last 30 years. The bricks are the same. It wouldn't be surprised me if the same people are sitting in the same seat. If I look at the picture on the right, an awful lot has changed in the last 30 years. We now have people to support the players. We support them physically, we support them mentally, we support them with their nutrition, we support them obviously with their technique and their tactics, we support them with their social media, we support them legally, we support them in terms of their travel. The list goes on. And in an international dressing room, there are probably more support staff than there would be players. So it's interesting for me to have seen over probably, if I'm honest, I reckon it's only about 5 years. But over the last 5 years, businesses have started to think about how they can be proactive in looking after their people. Often this has been triggered by something not great. The CEO's just had a heart attack or has collapsed through fatigue or was burnt out. But more and more organizations are starting to realize that they need to look after their people. So when I'm not working with sports teams, I'm doing a lot of work with businesses. And I am helping them sort of address what I often call the disconnects. Now, we're often brought in because of absence or attrition or accelerated change, but the conversations often end up being about the disconnects. And I wanted just to sort of highlight 3 or 4 of these that we often see. The first disconnect that I wanted to just highlight was the disconnect between our knowledge and our actions. You can see a couple of pictures in front of you. 2 potential options for breakfast. We probably would all know that the one on the left is the one that's going to be good for our health, and yet some of us might gravitate to the one on the right, not just occasionally, but with great regularity. We know that that's not good for our health, and yet we're the same people who often say, I want to be healthy. A very flippant example there, but again, when I work with organizations, I often get them to fill in a number of questionnaires. One of them is something called an energy and performance profiler. In that questionnaire, one of the questions asks people, do you feel a sense of satisfaction when you achieve your goals? Well, I aggregated the data last year from a group of NHS workers. There's probably around about anyway, about 500, 600 people, and 94% of them either agreed or strongly agreed with that statement. Yes, I do feel a sense of satisfaction when I achieve my goals. And then cunningly hidden away 2 questions later, people are asked, do you set goals for yourself regularly? And now we can see we're now down at 46%. It's interesting, we know a whole load of stuff makes us feel good, we know the stuff that allows us to be healthy, and yet we refuse to interact with those things with greater regularity. So that's disconnect number 1. Disconnect number 2 is the disconnect that sometimes occurs with our ability to use our brains, our ability to think straight, and in particular, our ability to utilize something known as the prefrontal cortex. That's the part of the brain that's highly developed in the human being. It's the part of the brain that allows us to deliver what are known as the executive functions. Things such as paying attention, planning, decision-making, evaluating, self-monitoring, and regulating emotions. All of these are highly critical things for the working world today. In fact, the World Economic Forum lists in terms of the top 10 skills that are required for this decade, a number of factors that relate to those functions, things like analytical thinking, complex problem solving, regulating emotions, resilience, being creative. These are all things that are recognized by leading bodies. The trouble is, when we're fatigued or when we're stressed, which is something that is on the increase as well, this part of the brain doesn't work so well. So the part of the brain that allows us to be special as a species, we do not engage with it as well as we could. That is disconnect number 2, the disconnect with our executive functions. And disconnect number 3, and when it comes to the mental health agenda, I think this is fairly relevant, is the disconnect between being a human being and a human doing. You see, if all we do in our lives is the human doing bit, and we never get to be a being, and that void between those two is highly significant, we create a degree of inner turmoil. I want to be doing something else. And I do think this is relevant when it comes to the mental health agenda. We just do, and we don't give ourselves time or permission just to be on the odd occasion. So that is disconnect number 3. Now, these disconnects cause a fair few problems. These could be broadly termed underneath the banner of stress, and it's a growing challenge. This data is slightly old now. It came from 2002 and 2013. These sort of big reviews that take place might only happen every decade. But this looks at the cost of workplace stress across Europe. Now, if we wanted to be involved in a growth industry, this looks like a pretty good one to have been in. And whilst we do end at 2013 there, I suspect that number has gone up considerably since. And stress is actually very good for us in short amounts. In fact, it's essential for us in short amounts. We will have all been stressed today in terms of releasing stress hormones. Otherwise, when we try to get out of bed this morning, we would have just fallen down again. We need to release adrenaline. That causes our blood vessels to constrict, which means our blood pressure rises, which means, as I say, we don't fall down when we try and get out of bed. We need to be stressed and release stress hormones on occasions. But if those hormones are released for long periods of time, we run into problems in a number of different dimensions. The first dimension is our health. And some of those conditions that I put there are quite trivial. Headaches and migraines might be considered trivial. Coughs and colds, well, that certainly was considered trivial up until the beginning of this year, maybe not so trivial now. I've highlighted a couple there because sometimes the trivial actually becomes serious. So let's take heartburn, for instance. Heartburn, if that's there with greater regularity, certainly increases the risk of esophageal cancer. That's not a great thing to happen. Heartburn is often triggered due to excessive stomach acid escaping into the esophagus. We produce excessive stomach acid when we're stressed and fatigued, and the level of prostaglandins, which are really important in creating a protective membrane in the stomach wall, they reduce. So there are a couple of problems there. I've also highlighted hypertension. We might have slightly raised blood pressure. Well, loads of people have slightly raised high blood pressure, don't they? Well, yes, they do. And those people are also the people who have a greater likelihood of suffering some of the more serious conditions later in life, things like stroke and heart attacks. So while stress is definitely linked with health, I think sometimes we just link it with the trivial things. but I just wanted to make the point that trivial isn't always trivial forever. One of the factors that happens when we are stressed for long periods of time is we release excessive cortisol. Now, cortisol is an important hormone. It does various things such as fight inflammation in our body, but it also has a corrosive effect, and it has the ability to hang around for long periods. So if we're stressed for a long time, the cortisol level builds up. And cortisol does certain things inside our brain. So not only is stress bad for our body, it's also bad for our thinking. Just to give you a quick run through of this, it results in an excessive amount of myelin being laid down. Now, myelin surrounds the neurons, and the neurons provide the messaging around the brain. So if there's excessive myelin, that messaging doesn't work quite as well as it could do. The amount of something called BDNF, that's brain-derived neurotrophic factor, well, that reduces, and this is a really important protein when it comes to the health of the cells within the brain. The actual just simple amount of grey matter, particularly in this prefrontal cortex, will diminish. The hippocampus, a part of the brain that does a number of things, but one of the things it's involved in is spatial awareness. That doesn't work so well. So, you know, if you can't remember where you put your car keys or your mobile phone, that's probably because your hippocampus isn't quite doing its job as well as it should do. And the amygdala, sometimes known as the fear center of the brain, that becomes more overactive. We become more primitive in our thinking and more primitive in our emotional responses. So stress not good for body, stress not good for brain. It's also not good for our behavior. There are certain psychosocial impacts. And I'm just going to sort of ask you a few questions and you just quietly reflect on these. So just when you're stressed, some people will tend to get a bit louder and crankier. Some people become a bit more introverted. Some people might have that mixed portfolio going on, that when you're at work, you're more introverted, but as soon as you're through the front door in the evening, it's kick the cat, etc. Some people might eat a bit more. Some people might eat a bit less. Some people might drink a bit more. Guilty as charged. Some people might indulge in other addictive behaviors, but our behaviors change. And if we think that relationships are often forged on typical behaviors, if those behaviors are changing for a long period of time, it's highly possible that our relationships can become fractured. If it leads to time off work, and for an awful lot of people it does, our self-esteem reduces. For many people, it's like going down that spiral staircase you can see in the picture. For many, it's very hard to stop, turn around and walk back up again. And it impacts our ability to be nice, our ability to be nice to other people, but also our ability to be nice to ourselves. And ultimately, we fail to cope. So I guess the antidote to stress is this concept of resilience, that one of the key words of today's session. And it's quite a hard word to describe or define. I mean, the dictionary will say it's our ability to deal with difficulties quickly. It's not about there being no difficulties, but it definitely has a time component as well. And I've tried to represent this on this graph. So we have person green and person red, they're bobbling along with life. And at time point 2, and that could be hours, days, whatever you want it to be, months, years, something happens. And for person red, the person with low resilience skill, the impact is significant. You can see there's a negative scale on the y-axis and a significant drop down. And the temporal component, well, that's significant as well. It takes the person quite a long time to recover. Whereas person green, the person with high resilience skills, the impact is nowhere near as great, and the time component is much quicker. So that's quite a useful way of thinking about resilience. I also wanted to sort of just highlight that resilience does not equal robustness. Now, the robust person is the person who constantly says, yes, I'll do it, not a problem, leave it there, no trouble. You might be that person, or you might know someone like that. All I will say is, if you start to see chinks in your armor, please do something, because the robust person, when they break, often breaks big. And that break could be in their health or their performance or both. The other thing I want to say about resilience, it is a two-way street. We often think our resilience is being threatened by everything that's changing in the world out there. It's everything that's going on out there that's a problem. Let me tell you the story of the glass of water. The story of the glass of water features my children. They're 24 and 20 now, so they've grown out of this habit. But when we sit down for a meal in the evening when they were growing up, it would be inevitable that one of them would spill a glass of water. And most evenings, I just go and get a cloth and we mop it up and sit down and have a nice family meal. Occasionally, however, same time, Same people, same place, same thing happens, but my reaction will be totally different. The only thing that has changed there is me. So we need to recognize that resilience is a two-way street. We could drive on either side, but I tell you what, managing your own side is a darn sight easier than managing the whole of the world. So resilience definitely starts with us. We need to understand how we interact with the world, not just how the world impacts us. I think it's quite useful to sort of break resilience down into a skill. Let's think of it as a process. How can I get out of bed tomorrow and go, hey, I'm resilient? Well, you'll need to think about how you can do that. The first part of the skill is to actually just create these moments of recognition. If you do not stop and think, how am I? Where am I at? Do you know what? The rest is going to become potluck. It will then move on to reframing or releasing. Reframing is all about taking back control. If you find yourself using a lot of language with words that end at N', you know, words like isn't, shouldn't, couldn't, didn't, just stop yourself and think, right, hold on, let's create a few sentences with can and will. Let's take back control of the situation. Let's create a positive mindset. You might need to release, and this is a really easy one to say, but a really quite tricky one to do. Releasing is just letting go. There's a problem there, but I can't do anything about it. I've just got to let it go. All I will say about this is the more mindful you are about this, the more deliberate you are about this, the more accountable you make to that yourself to that release, the easier it will become. Something we need to practice. Once we've done that, potentially we then move on to reset. I'm going to talk a little bit more about reset in a minute, but it's something that human beings are incredibly bad at. And then we can respond and react. But I will just put one last caveat in place. Unless this is all underpinned by strong foundations, things such as, a bit of exercise and eating healthily and sleeping well and having good relationships, these real foundation stones of our well-being, this is a really hard skill, as are most other skills in life. Really hard skill to actually deliver. We need to get the foundation stones right. So if it starts with recognition, I thought I'd talk you through a few little recognition processes. I've actually already asked you to do this by sort of thinking about your organization and how fatigued it is. You could have done that on an individual basis. You could have flipped the question and asked yourself, how energized do I feel? But this is a model that I use with my team on a fairly regular basis. It's called In the Zone model. It's modified from an original piece of work done by Bruce and Goschel. It looks at the relationship between energy and focus. And like most of these quadrants, top right-hand corner is the place to be. High energy, high focus. That's called purposeful. Bottom right-hand corner, high energy, but not much focus. That's chaos. Bottom left, low energy and low focus. That's known as the procrastination corner. Not a lot's been done. And top left, you know what you need to do. You have to focus. You just simply don't have the energy to do it. That is fatigue and potentially burnout. And I bring this out with regularity with the team, and we score ourselves. And we score ourselves in a number of dimensions. And here's just an example. This is one of my scores from last year. So we put in place a percentage. Of course, all those percentages need to add up to 100%. And we'll look at our feelings about how we're getting on at work. We'll look at how we are doing away from work. The third dimension potentially is how we're doing as a team. And then we'll have a discussion about why, because the numbers are interesting, but it's the conversations around why that are way more interesting. And the more you can have these conversations, the more you understand your people, and the more they understand you, and the more you'll be able to support each other. Just a couple of little tips here. If you find your chaos score is getting higher and higher, please do something, because the only place you're going to go is up into fatigue. And the other thing I would just say, try not to go from chaos straight into purposeful. You would have seen the bottom left-hand box has now changed from procrastination to a word that I prefer, pause. It's much easier to go from chaos to hold on a minute, think, realign, and then into purposeful. These moments of pause are really important. And that brings me on to this concept of reset. This thing that I say human beings are really rubbish at. There's a picture there of a racing car. Every 15 laps or so, that racing car will pull into the pits. It will get new tires, more petrol, maybe something done to the chassis, etc. And it stops for a reason. That reason is, I want to win the race. So the car invests in stopping because it wants to win the race. What do human beings do? We just keep on going and going and going until the race often beats us. So I'd encourage you all to think about, how can you reset at an intellectual level? How can you reset nutritionally? How can you reset physically? And how could you reset emotionally? How do you create that moment of pause? And this is really tricky at the moment. You know, this working from home, when we're going from Zoom to Zoom to Zoom to Zoom to Zoom meeting, we don't even have that moment of pause moving from meeting room 1 to meeting room 3. It's just, oh gosh, I need to be on another meeting, bye. And just flick a button and you're there. It's really tough, and I think we need to actually encourage people to create those moments of emotional and intellectual reset, not just sort of eating and exercising, although they're important too, and I'm going to potentially come on to those as well a little bit in a moment. But I encourage you all to think about, how can I reset? I mentioned the foundation stones. I tend to call these the KHPIs, the key human performance indicators. I suspect many of you have got KPIs that you need to hit. Well, you'll just have to take it from me. I personally believe that the KHPI, the key human performance indicator, is the catalyst that will allow you to achieve those KPIs with greater regularity. We've only got time to potentially talk about a couple, and even these two quite briefly. So I thought I'd talk about the 2 R's, recharge and responsibility. Arianna Huffington is hardly a Nobel scientist, but I do think that's an incredibly good quote. Everything you do, you'll do better with a good night's sleep. It's a hard one to argue against. And I guess in the line of business that many of you will be involved in terms of crisis, it's probably worth reflecting that fatigue can cause some pretty serious stuff. We've got a number of events there, going back to the space shuttle disaster, Chernobyl, the Exxon Valdez spill, 3 Mile Island and Costa Concordia. And in the official reports of all of those, fatigue is cited as one of the potential reasons behind some of these problems, and certainly something that needs to be addressed. So in your world, this is an important thing. But I'm going to take it down to a rather more granular level and just think about sleep at a personal level. So what is good sleep? Well, an adult human being needs to go through 5 complete sleep cycles to get truly restorative sleep. And there's a big difference between rest and restoration that I'm going to come on to. So this gives you an example of a sleep cycle. We could have split it into 6 or 7 different stages. I've gone for 4 for simplicity. I just want to draw your attention straight away to stage 3, delta sleep, which you can see can average anywhere between 40 and 90 minutes a cycle. And this is why some people only need maybe 5.5 hours sleep if you're on the 40-minute end of the spectrum. Some people will need 9 hours plus if you're on the 90-minute end of the spectrum. Most people are going to be sort of somewhere in the middle, around about 7 3/4, 8 hours or so to get people through the 5 complete hours. So I'm going to assume that we're sort of average and we're in the middle, and that sort of means that our sleep looks a bit like this: 5 cycles, 96 minutes a cycle. Hey presto, we've got 8 hours. Looks pretty simple, but if we go underneath the surface, we can see it's a little bit more complex. I don't want you to sort of try and take in this graph in great depth at all, so I'll just sort of draw your attention to a couple of key themes. The first key theme is that delta sleep, the type of sleep that's meant to restore us physically, well, that tends to be more dominant in the first few cycles of sleep. And REM sleep, the part of sleep that's there to really sort our brains out, allow us to lay down memories and learning, that tends to be a lot more dominant in the back end of sleep. So if we want to get good body and brain recovery, we need to get our sleep right all night. Now, I spend quite a lot of my working week measuring sleep and measuring stress. This is the device I use. It's called a Bodyguard. And I'm going to apologize now in advance because for the next bit, I need to give you a 30-second physiology lesson, because this is important for what we're going to look at moving forward when I tell you some of the stories about people we've worked with. So yes, we do measure heart rate, and that's interesting, but what we're way more intrigued by is something called R-to-R interval, which is sometimes known as heart rate variability. R-to-R interval is the distance between the 2 R spikes on a PQRST complex. You can see that in the diagram on the right-hand side of the screen. The reason this is useful is it provides a physiological mirror that allows us to understand something called the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system controls all the things we don't think about, things like our digestion and our sweating and our breathing and our blood pressure and our heart rate, etc. And it has two branches. It has a sympathetic branch and a parasympathetic branch. Now, the sympathetic branch, that becomes activated when we're stressed or loaded. You know, my sympathetic branch would definitely be activated at the moment. What happens is our blood pressure slightly elevates, we sweat a bit more, we start releasing adrenaline, and if that's for prolonged periods, cortisol, and our heart will start to beat like a metronome. So I could have a heart rate of 60. If I'm in a state of sympathetic dominance, it really will be 1 beat every second with great regularity. The other branch, the parasympathetic branch, well, that kicks in when we're in a state of recovery. We start releasing hormones such as DHEA, our recovery hormone. Our blood pressure lowers. We could still have a heart rate of 60, but our heart would beat quickly for 5 or 10 seconds, then slowly for 5 or 10, quickly for 5 or 10, then slowly. So by looking at these variations, beat to beat interval, we are able to evaluate what's going on hormonally within the body. We could have used blood pressure, but obviously putting a blood pressure cuff on people for a long period of time is pretty impractical. That's why we use the pattern of the heart rate. So I'm just going to show you a few examples here. This is someone who just works in an office. There's a 24-hour trace, so you can see the timeline along the bottom. The red color in that graph is when that person is in a state of sympathetic dominance, very typical during the working day. The blue color, well, that's when they were exercising. And then the turquoisey green color, that is the parasympathetic dominance when they're recovering. So this person, tough day at work, did a bit of exercise in the morning, which was great. They've gone to bed just before midnight and they've gone straight into that turquoise color. If that was me, I'd be reasonably happy with that as a day. Then 1 or 2 tweaks, but I'd be reasonably happy with that as a day. It's pretty balanced. This is the same person the very next day. The only recovery they get here is between 5:30 and 6:30 in the morning. They actually went to sleep at exactly the same time as the night before. So this is one of these examples of rest, but not restoration. This is a very obvious example. This person took clients out for dinner, about 2/3 of a bottle of wine, and ate late. So 3 things that are potentially going to impact their sleep: work all day and all evening, eating late, not great, and alcohol. Now, I drink. This isn't me saying don't do it, but I will just say that typically for every unit of alcohol that someone takes on board in the evening, they probably lose around about an hour's worth of quality sleep. Alcohol is a toxic substance. We've got to work hard to deal with it. And that's why people often wake up not feeling so clever the next morning. From that data, we can draw a line that's often called the battery line or the resilience line. This line will always start on the midpoint of the y-axis on the left-hand side over here. It will drop down when the person's in the red, and the gradient of the line will be in proportion to the physiological response. It does for most of us. That's why we go to bed. We're tired. But you can see the recharge was effective. The books were balanced on day 1. On day 2, the line went down and it stayed down. And I think you can imagine what's going to happen to this person's ability to think straight, communicate well, lead effectively, maintain good body language if they're consistently down there. That was a very obvious example of someone drinking. This is something that I see way more often. This is a 72-hour data trace, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, back to back. I call it the dripping tap effect. Can you see how every day the person's down a bit and then a bit more and a bit more? And this is interesting because most people go, well, you know, that's work, isn't it? Of course it's going to be like that. Well, the first 10,000 days of data we analysed in the UK, interestingly, the toughest day of the week was Saturday, closely followed by Sunday. When we have these magical 2 days that allow us to recover, we don't always do it so well for a whole host of reasons. But, you know, I think we need to be aware of the dripping tap, and I think we also need to be aware that when we have the moment to recover, how am I going to do it effectively? Exhibit 2, this is someone who came to see me with a bad back. Interesting, they told me about their back for about 20 seconds. They told me about their life for about 20 minutes. So as a physiotherapist, I had option A, go push, 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 click, 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 bend your knees when you lift, all of that sort of stuff. But we had a look at the life, and you can see they're doing hard exercise for about 40 minutes just before bed. So I asked them what on earth was going on there, and the person said, look, I'm so frustrated at work. I've gone out and I've bought myself a punch bag. I've been reading about stress management. You know, exercise is meant to be good. So I get in and then I just go home and I beat out of the punch bag, so I'm so off with work. Right idea, wrong timing, wrong dosage. You see, exercise is great, but it's also a stimulant. So if you do it just before bed, you can see what happens to the sleep. We also raise our core body temperature. That's not a great thing to do. Now, often when I'm doing this talk, you can see people frowning and going, well, I exercise in the evening. Is he saying I shouldn't do that? To be honest with you, the most important thing is you exercise. But the point I want to make with this slide is to raise the challenge of the negotiable, non-negotiable conundrum. On a Tuesday, I play basketball. Not in lockdown, of course, but on Tuesday, I go and play basketball. I do it at 8:30 in the evening. I do it at that time because that's when the court is available and that's when my friends can make it. I'm appalling at basketball, but I run up and down the court. I love it. I come in looking like a tomato afterwards. Basketball is a non-negotiable. But on a Tuesday, I'm really quite strict about making sure that I have my main meal in the middle of the day. I might have a snack at around about 5 or 6 o'clock. I'll pre-hydrate before I go and play. I'll get everything ready for work before I go out. Because of course, if I don't do that, I come in from basketball and then I eat my main meal. Then I'll chuck loads of fluid down my neck. If I don't have a cold shower on that night, I will go to bed with an elevated core body temperature. Now, it doesn't create the perfect night's sleep, but it helps balance things out a little bit. And I think it's important to recognize that on a day-to-day basis, these challenges vary. We need to think about the different non-negotiables and negotiables on a daily basis. Third slide, I want to show you one about when work's bad, one when work's good, and then we'll wrap things up. So we can see quite clearly this person's sleep is not great. This was a person who was a fairly senior HR director in the UK. They weren't drinking, they weren't eating late, they weren't going out, they weren't exercising late, but you can also see that between 1 and 2, there's quite a mountain of load, quite a mountain of stress. So they looked back at their diary and they just went, oh yes, that's when I met my boss. I hate my boss. And it was quite clear there was a very toxic relationship here. What I'm going to tell you now is totally impractical for many, many people, but this person decided to leave their job about a week later. It had probably been brewing underneath the surface, but the data certainly led this person to a conversation with themselves. What do I really want to get out of life? And it certainly wasn't working in this organization. And the last example I want to show is this one. This is an important one. This is a cancer nurse who once a week has to do a very tough clinic. Now, her perception was that was the most stressful time of her week. My perception was that's the most stressful time of her week. That's her doing the clinic. And the more I do this, the more I see when people are doing things that are closely aligned with their values, closely aligned with their competencies, in an environment they're happy, with people they get on with, we often see it physiologically. I also just want to highlight this person's sleep, which is appalling. We had a conversation and I asked this person, whether they were struggling to detach from work. This was a really tough day. And they thought long and hard and they went, you know what, Simon, I think I'm pretty good at that. I've done this job for 12 years. So my next question was, well, what do you do in the evening? I said, well, I do a bit of reading and a bit of writing. I went, well, that's normally pretty good. What's that all about? They said, oh, yes, I've got to get my PhD in 6 weeks' time. Just as she said it, you could see the penny drop. And the reason for telling you that story is I think human beings are really good at dealing with disaster because we see it. Are better at dealing with disaster, maybe not really good, but better at dealing with disaster because we see it. What we're dreadful at is evaluating all of those things that just cause that submaximal load and just creep underneath the surface until one day they bring us down. My practice has been changed on the back of data because it allows me to really tell people how they are doing. I'm not using a textbook, I'm using their story and their data. The trouble is, so many of us are incredibly good at the skill of self-delusion. And this is the fourth disconnect that I'm often highlighting with individuals when we're working with them. I just wanted to highlight why data is useful. Here is some data that looks at a recent group that I work with, a number of civil servants. Before we wire them up with monitors, we asked some questions. This question was, are you active enough to be healthy? You know, we're not talking triathlons or marathons, but do you do enough exercise just to be healthy? Well, in this case, a considerable number, I think it's around about 85%, I'm guessing, because my picture is sat over the top of the slide. I can't quite see it. Thought, yes, they were. Yes, I do enough exercise just to be healthy. When we looked at them physiologically, we saw a rather different picture. And whenever I'm looking at physical activity, I know there are always going to be people at both ends of the line. So I tend to do that, and that gives me a much better view on the trend across the cohort. And yeah, this lot were nowhere near when it comes to doing enough physical activity to be healthy. So that's enough about sleep. Quickly, I wanted to touch on responsibility, because when it comes to resilience, I think this is really important. When I show this slide of the cancer nurse, a lot of people will resonate with that. They'll go, yeah, I understand that. I feel good when I do things that are closely aligned with my values. At which point, I often want to put the challenge out there, well, if you know that, can I just ask you what your values are? And many people will struggle to articulate them. So we're coming towards the end of the year. You might have some time off. I encourage you to see if you can come up with a value statement for yourself. So I'm going to just tell you mine. My value statement is I want to be respected as a physiotherapist, and I want to be respected as a thought leader in my field. I want to work for an organization where no job is too big for the organization and no person in the organization is too big for a job. And my immediate family is the most important thing in my life. And the reason I have that statement is if I have a challenge in front of me and I have a number of options available to me, I often check in with it. And I always try and get dragged towards the option that's most closely aligned with that statement. Because when it comes to my resilience, if I'm living a life here and yet I'm doing things over here, if I have a will to be here and yet I'm behaving over here, there's a problem. And that's not a great problem. It will impact my health, particularly my mental health, and it will almost undoubtedly impact my performance. So to wrap up, before we have any questions, I asked you a couple of questions. One of those questions at the beginning was, what level of expectations you place on yourself? Now, typically most people score themselves at sort of reasonably high. You know, it's rare for someone to say 2. It's never, but it's rare. The reason for asking you that question is that if you did score yourself high, it's really important that you consider how you support yourself. Here's some research done in the world of sport. It looks at the relationship between expectation, support, and performance. David Young did this research. He's now the psychologist who looks after England cricket, and he looked at a whole host of people who play professional cricket across the UK. He was very clear. The higher performers were ones where high expectation was placed upon them, but high support was given. And the ones who did the worst were the ones where high expectation was placed upon them, but low support was given. It makes sense. It's the least authentic position to be. I want, but I'm not prepared to give a thing. In fact, if you're going to have low support in place, put low expectation in place. Your organization will do much better. I just wanted to finish off with one last case study. This is the UK head of risk for a finance organization when I first met them. It's a bit of a car crash, as you can see. I asked them when we went through their data, what do you love doing? And they said, I love roller skating. In fact, they spent 15 minutes telling me how they loved roller skating. I heard about the whoosh, the glide, the slide, the whiz, the freedom, the energy, etc., etc. So I asked them, well, when did you last go roller skating? About 6 months ago. Oh, okay. Anyway, a plan was put in place. This person agreed to start doing something that they really loved. They had an incredibly busy job, but they said, yeah, I'll give it a go. And this was their data 6 weeks later. Partly because they're doing physical activity, which is going to be good, but I think the way more important message is they're also doing something that they love. And I think it's really important for you to respect yourself, even if you want to work well. The kicker in the tail here is this person is promoted to become global head of risk 8 months later. Not only is this stuff quite good for your health, not only is it quite good for your well-being, it's really quite good for your career, you know. That was the data of fluffy stuff and the battle for resilience. I hope that was useful. I hope you've reflected on where you're at, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Simon. That's really interesting and some real valuable stuff there. We do have 2 or 3 questions in already. I probably need 5 or 10 minutes at the end, so we'll definitely get through those. But if you have questions still and you haven't posted them, please do so. So the first one, Simon, is any advice on what we can do to spot stress within our teams? So not ourselves, but our team members, and how can we best support those people as well?
I think there are 2 things I suggest. So the first thing is, how do you spot it? Look for changes in behavior. Look at changes in a person's routine. You know, are they getting in a bit later? Are they getting in a bit earlier? You know, there's not a right or, but there's a change. And if there's a change, something's probably happening. You know, are they staying at the office late? Sometimes that's because they don't want to go home. You know, we all go on about the problem being workplace stressed. Often it's things away from work, but just look for changes. Does their appearance look different? Is the language different in their emails? You're almost a bit of a detective. So that would be one of my key tips. Look for changes. And the other thing is that energy focus quadrant. Create regular conversations, and then you all become more comfortable about the conversations. You don't spot it, they tell you. And you know what? They're looking out for you as well. Creates this team ethic.
As with many things in 2020, that's even harder now than it would normally be, because we're having to pick up on these signals without being in the same physical location as others. So I guess that makes it incumbent upon us to be a bit more willing to ask and check in and metaphorically feel the pulse of one's colleagues.
Absolutely. I mean, my style has changed over 2020, so I would probably have been much more coachy and nurturing. I've now had to find that I'm more direct in my question. Mm-hmm. So initially, we might then move on to back into nurture coach, but I tend to be much more direct in 2020 than I was in 2019.
Thank you. Question from Andrea. Any practical tips on what I can do during the Christmas break to set myself up to succeed in 2021?
Okay, well, I mean, there's loads of different sort of ideas around goal setting, and you know, we all make New Year's resolutions, and actually come January the 4th, they've all gone out the window, haven't they? I think the trouble is we have this sort of dream of where we want to be, and we sort of have a strategy. The most important thing is to actually create an emotional anchor, an emotional attachment with where you want to go to. So there's no point in saying, I want to go and exercise, if there isn't a reason for doing it. You know, that reason might be I want to be able to kick a football around the garden with the grandkids when I'm older. It might be I want to look great. It might be I want to run a marathon in 2 hours 28.71. Whatever it is, create your personal attachment and create an accountability mechanism.
Yeah. Okay. And third question from John is, how can I get a better night's sleep? I find myself waking up in the middle of the night thinking about work. So it's something that moves in your sleep charts. What would be your first suggestions on how to address that?
Cool. It's something, I mean, there's loads of tips around sleep, but I'll just give you one, which is about switching your mind off. You see, people are very good at switching their bodies off, but they forget about switching this off. So if I'm going through a really busy period of my life, about 45 minutes before I go to bed, blank book, line down the middle of the page. On the left-hand side, I write down, what have I done today? Do you know what? I normally feel a bit better about life because I've actually just, oh, gee, I've done all of that. That's quite good. On the right-hand side, I write down what needs to be tomorrow. I look at it. I slowly close the book, 5 deep breaths, and I'm giving myself permission to switch my brain off. And this is a proactive approach, and it's a formal approach. So many people say, I'm good. I've got a pen and paper by the side of my bed. So if I wake up at 3, I can write something down. Why didn't you write it down before you went to bed? Yeah. So just proactively and formally switching your mind off, it needs to be through documentation.
Fantastic. And I think we've got time for one more, and this one is from Carol, who says, thank you, lots of food for thought. Do you think meditation and mindfulness have a physical impact?
Yes, they do. I mean, you know, we monitor people, and often they'll be doing meditation and mindfulness. but is it always a good impact?
Right.
It's the best impact for you. Some people will be very good at meditation and will love it. Other people will find it incredibly tough. And this is really important.
Sometimes meditation or mindfulness can be stressful.
Well, it is, because you think, I should be able to do this and I should be really good at it. And you're not. And you know what? An apple a day doesn't keep the doctor away if you're allergic to apples. So why do we tell everyone to do the same thing? You know, you've got to go and find out your own recipe. But this is where the data is really useful.
Fantastic. I'm checking. Yeah, I think we're at the end of the questions. So let me just double check there isn't one just popped in. No, it's simply someone saying, Donna saying, thank you, Simon. So from me also, thank you, Simon, and for everybody on this webinar. So I'm going to cover off a couple of things in the last 5 minutes, but I did want to say A, thanks, Simon, and B, let you on this webinar know that in the email that we send out, there will be a link so that you can answer a 15-minute online questionnaire, which will then give you your own energy and performance profile. So if you'd like to kind of explore your own situation in a little bit more detail and perhaps, you know, draw some learnings and insights out of that, you'll be able to do that. But otherwise, Simon, thank you. And I know you'd be very happy via the email address here to answer any questions on a kind of one-to-one basis as well.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for having me, Jonathan. Been good fun. Thank you.
And now your final task, Simon, if you could move the slide on. Thank you. So just in the last 5 minutes, clearly we intentionally focused on this session on personal resilience rather than organizational resilience, as is normal. But if in the same way you're maybe doing a personal resilience health check at the end of this year, that, you know, whole thing about the Christmas period and the start of a new year, do please also think about doing an organizational resilience health check. And one of the best and certainly cheapest ways of doing that is by taking our free online crisis readiness scorecard test. There will also be a link to that in the follow-up email, or you will very quickly find it on our website. It is the kind of thing that if you are starting to put together your crisis management program for next year, I think might give you some useful insights. So do feel free to take a look at that and complete that. Beyond that, I think for all of us, 2020 has been a hugely challenging year. Despite that, I think it also does prove the truism that out of crisis comes opportunity. There are some learnings that I'm sure you will have all derived that you wouldn't otherwise have derived if we hadn't had to face this monumental crisis. And there's been great creativity, and frankly there's been great work done by the people on this call to respond to the extraordinary events that we have been faced with. That said, I am very much hoping that 2021 will be a better and a more positive year for everyone, and with vaccines now on the horizon, it's looking much more positive than it did 6 months ago. The passion that drives me on in this business is to help businesses to avoid the needless damage and devastation that is caused by a crisis, and so prevent harm to both themselves, the organizational harm, but also to the stakeholders within the business. And if you could move the slide on for me, please, Simon. And so one of the things that I have been doing during 2020 is writing a book. It's entitled Crisis Proof: How to Prepare for the Worst Day of Your Business Life. That will probably be just about published in 2020. Yes, 2020, but we will be launching it in 2021. And so we'll be running some special webinars in the early part of next year to reveal some of the tips, insights and best practice from within that book. And we will also be launching a new package of support and services based on the book, primarily coaching and training services to enable both business leaders, those responsible for crisis management, and also those that may have a part to play within a crisis management team, to have the confidence, capability, tools and skills that they need to succeed in that environment. And that will be through one-to-one coaching, group training, online and face-to-face. So we have some exciting plans for next year, and I'm very much hoping that we can work with, you know, the clients and maybe even some of the non-clients who are on this call to help you be ready to do and say the right things on the worst day of your business lives. And we'll be sending out details of the book and the activity around that over the next few weeks. So Simon, if you could do one more click for me now. Thank you to everyone who's joined not just this webinar but previous webinars this year. Thank you to those of our clients who are on this call, and thank you to everyone. As I say, you are all, by the fact that you're on this call, you are in one way or another involved in crisis management, and I think you have all done sterling work during 2020 to look after your businesses and to minimise the harm that COVID has caused. Do take some time to take on board Simon's advice and look after yourselves as well. I wish you a peaceful and a productive final few weeks of 2020, and as I say, an even better and more positive 2021. So we will see you and speak with you again in the new year. Thank you very much.